And we know that Avinu Malkeinu is one of the real highlight prayers of our High Holy Days. But today maybe we'll learn a little something new about this prayer. So Avinu Malkeinu, and we know that in Hebrew, the word Avinu comes from the same word as Av, meaning father. So Avinu is our father. Malkeinu comes from the same root as Melech, meaning king. So Malkeinu is our, the new ending is our, so our king, our father, our king. So this prayer is, of course, one of the central prayers of the 10 days of repentance, beginning on Rosh Hashanah. And the words and the melody evoke deep emotion as we connect with God. And we're connecting with God as Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. On Yom Kippur, it's recited throughout the day, culminating in its recitation as part of the Ne'ilah service and the final moments of the holiday. But before that, it's important to note that Avinu Malkeinu, so it became popular, like it says here, around the 5th century, and it's composed of one-line stanzas, which is interesting because it means that there's not just one solid text. If you look at the different Avinu Malkeinus as they appear throughout our books, we find that let's go back. We find that all of the different texts are different from one another. Certainly there's similarities among them, but there's also a great deal of difference among them as well. So they can easily be altered and adapted. Now, we had talked last time about prayers that really had been adapted, and there were all different sorts of adaptations to the Unatan Tokef prayer. Avinu Malkeinu really had the ability to adapt it in a way that the Unatan Tokef didn't. And so what I did is I included the text within here of Avinu Malkeinu as it appears in our Rosh Hashanah morning service. So if you had your Machzor in front of you, you would actually see the words of text that we're going to go to. I'm going to go back to these words of text so that we can hear it in just a few minutes. But before we do, we have an opportunity to hear the melody, which I know speaks to us just as much as the words do. Can you hear that? Okay.
Stopped.
Avinu Malkeinu, Chatanu lefanecha. Avinu Malkeinu, Chamol aleinu, Me'alol aleinu, V'tareinu. Avinu Malkeinu,
Okay. All right, my computer seems to not be responding very quickly.
Rabbi, do you want me to open it and share it?
It's not the sharing. It's just, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. So, just before we actually look at the words of Avinu Malkeinu, I just want to see if there's anything that comes up for you when you hear this melody.
Well, I find it very haunting. It's actually my favorite melody in all the services, and it's the reason I joined the choir because of that one piece.
Hmm. It's the melody specifically that speaks to you, Eve?
Yeah, it's really the melody. Yes, I find it very mysterious and very haunting. Um, yeah, I can't. I can't speak to the words so much as the melody. Yes.
And that was a common theme as well with Unatana Tokaf, right? The words might not speak to us in the same way, or in some cases they really, really do, but there's something about the melody that really gets to our souls. And so sometimes if we are in a different place and we're hearing a different melody than we're used to, it really hits us in the gut because it's like, hey, that's not the right one. And it's interesting because it's so powerful. So powerful that it got you to join this choir even to be a part of it.
True. Yes, absolutely. And yes, I don't like other versions of it. That's the only. I was when he said he was going to play it. I thought I hope he plays the one that my version, the one that I love.
Yeah, anyone else? It looked like a couple people might unmute. Feel free to do that if you have something you want to share.
It was interesting, just automatically my eyes closed and I was transported. Even though we're not in the service, even though it's not Rosh Hashanah, it goes through me. I feel it emotionally. And the words, and I agree with Eve, the melody. There's just something very profound about it, and in some ways even more than Kol Nidre, although Kol Nidre hits me in a different way. So
I think there's a bigness, a grandness. It kind of connects you to the notion of majesty, as you said, as you taught us what the words mean. It's very big.
It is. It's something that is so much bigger than ourselves. It's also a very different feel than our regular Friday night services when we all come together. So I do want to take us into the words, and hopefully my computer was only having a problem with the music. That these words here, the way it's translated, it doesn't translate the words Avinu Malkeinu here, which, as I said earlier, means literally our Father, our King, and we'll talk a little bit about that language shortly. But it just keeps the phrase Avinu Malkeinu. So, Avinu Malkeinu, Almighty and merciful. Almighty and merciful, hear our prayer. That's the Shema Kolenu. Avinu Malkeinu, we have strayed and sinned before you. Avinu Malkeinu, have compassion on us and our families. Avinu Malkeinu, halt the onslaught of sickness, violence, and hunger. Avinu Malkeinu, halt the reign of those who cause pain and terror. Avinu Malkeinu, enter our names in the book of lives well lived. This Chaim Tovim, instead of the book of life, it's translated in our Machzor as the book of lives well lived. Avinu Malkeinu, renew for us a year of goodness. Avinu Malkeinu, almighty and merciful, answer us with grace, for our deeds are wanting. Save us through acts of justice and love. Is there anything within these words that speaks to you or that strikes you when we're paying special attention to all of them? And I know I can't show the slide with all of the words all at once. I know that makes it a little more challenging. If you happen to have a Moxor in front of you, if you just happen to have it handy, it's on page 220 to 223. You could follow along with that if that's easier, just to have the words in front of you. And this is just one of the versions of Avinu Malkeinu.
I think for me, I think also of standing under a wedding chuppah. I think of a blessing for my family during the B'nai Mitzvah of my children. I feel cloaked and protected under wonderment of possibility to do better in the new year.
So you actually feel this feeling of protection.
Protection and hope that with teshuvah and with consciousness of action, I can help create the year that I seek.
That's beautiful. Yeah, Michael.
I think the words and the music together are a very pleading combination. I think I could picture hearing this and singing this while on my knees, because I feel that I'm begging in this prayer and with this music.
So that's really interesting because that's two different interpretations of what this prayer is. So for you, Michael, it's kind of a begging and pleading with God.
Yes.
As opposed to this idea of being cloaked and having almost being affirmed that we can create something positive in the next year. Now, I think throughout the High Holy Days, we have both, but we have both of those messages that come up a myriad of different ways. But it's interesting how in the same prayer with the same words, we can internalize it differently at that moment. And I think that's part of the mystery of it. That's part of the power of it, is that we all connect to it depending on what's going on for us and what perhaps we need from the prayer. So I want to share something else within here that it's a piece of a text from the Talmud that relates to this prayer of Avinu Malkeinu. So there was an incident that was involving Rabbi Eliezer. For those of you who are in Torah study earlier today, we talked about Rabbi Eliezer there too. Same guy. But this is a story involving Rabbi Eliezer, who descended to serve as a prayer leader before the ark on a fast day. And he recited 24 blessings, but he was not answered. Rabbi Akiva descended before the ark after him and said, "Our father, our king, Avinu Malkeinu, we have no king other than you. Our father, our king, for your sake have mercy on us." And rain immediately fell. The sages were whispering among themselves that Rabbi Akiva was answered while his teacher, Rabbi Eliezer, was not. A divine voice emerged and said, "Is it not because the sage Rabbi Akiva? It is not because the sage Rabbi Akiva is greater than that one, Rabbi Eliezer, but that this one is forgiving and that one is not forgiving." God responded to Rabbi Akiva's forgiving nature in kind by sending rain. So what's going on here? What is this talking about? Can anyone make sense of it? I'll help if you can't, but I'm kind of curious what you take, because everyone sees their own little thing in our texts.
I think that in the prayer of Avinu Malkeinu, we are asking something from God all the time, or as they said, pleading. But in this document here, we have to show something that we're worthy of that.
So there's like a humility that's going on here. Yeah, certainly. Um, there is a difference if someone comes and asks politely, "Can I please have this?" Or if someone comes and demands it because they're entitled to it. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on here. Rabbi Eliezer, he asks for rain. I gave you my 24 prayers. I said the words I was supposed to say. Why isn't there rain, God? This isn't okay. Whereas Rabbi Akiva comes before God from a place of humility and offers this heartfelt prayer to God, hoping that there will be rain, but understanding that this is a favor, that he needs to humble himself before God. And God responds to that prayer because that prayer is from the heart. And so this whole idea of Avinu Malkeinu as a prayer, it comes to exist because of this text. The Avinu Malkeinu is our chance to open ourselves up to God and to humble ourselves before God so that we can do the work that is needed in order to create the world that we want in front of us, that we want to create the year ahead that we wish to see. First, we have to humble ourselves. First, we have to acknowledge that we are very much imperfect, that we have a long way to go, and we have to ask for God's forgiveness and mercy.
Rabbi, do you happen to know where that picture comes from? It's sensational.
I would have to get out of this and look at the little thumbnail of where it came from. It was a free picture that I found online.
Beautiful.
It is stunning. I can let you know later. Yeah, it is a very pretty picture. I needed something that worked with the grandness of this prayer, and that felt appropriate. Do any of you know what word clouds are? So like essentially a word cloud is like when we take the words of something, we put it into a word processor and it comes out with an image. So what I did is I took the long version of Avinu Malkeinu, the one that is way longer than the one that I just read to you, and I threw it in a word cloud. And this is the image that I was given. And you can see that the two biggest words of Avinu and Malkeinu, it's Father and King. And you can see other themes that come up throughout this prayer all around it. Now, there is a lot of talk among rabbis, and there has been for quite some time. Why is the word that's used here, why are the words so masculine? Why our Father, our King? In Judaism, there are so many names for God. Some are masculine, some are feminine, and some are not gendered at all. So why is this prayer masculine? And Bachya ibn Pakuda responds to this. And he says, had they limited themselves to abstract terms and concepts appropriate to God, we would have understood neither the terms nor the concepts. The words and ideas used have accordingly to be such are adapted to the hearer's mental capacity so that the subject would first sink into his mind in the corporal sense in which the concrete terms are understood. Then we can proceed to an understanding that the presentation is only approximate and metaphorical, and that the reality is too subtle, too exalted, and remote for us to comprehend its subtlety. If we were to use words like, "O Eternal One," yes, those words have meaning, but the Avinu Malkeinu prayer is talking about a God that is close to us. When we use the word Father, the kind of emotional response that comes from using the word Father is not the same as the emotional response that we use or that we receive by using eternal, or even using the word parent. Parent is general, whereas father feels very personal, very relational. It's a one-on-one relationship. And so there's been a ton of debate within the Reform Jewish world. Should we change the interpretation of this prayer? Should we change how we translate it? And obviously in our Machzor, in this particular translation, they just chose not to translate the words Avinu Malkeinu. But many scholars say, no, we need to keep our Father, our King, not because we believe that God is masculine, but rather because there is something that is so personal about that. And once we start from the personal and we can connect to it, from there we can go to the metaphor. So I'm kind of curious because each of us have different understandings. Okay, I'll stop this. Each of us have different understandings of God. Each of us connect to different names of God. And perhaps that can change from moment to moment as well as from person to person. But when you read the words of Avinu Malkeinu, do you agree with what Pekuda says? Or do you have kind of a different feeling on that?
I have a different feeling on that, Rabbi.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to start off by thanking you for these sessions. And I think that because historically men are the ones that have been in power, and men have been the ones that have been authors. They are the ones that designate the terminology. And even what the commentator said, we don't, as Americans, we don't relate to a king. And we haven't related to a king since the 1700s. So even that language is outmoded. It's more of an authority figure, for example.
So you'd want to reinterpret it to take out the idea of king, because that really doesn't speak to us in the same way anymore.
Yes.
Well, it seems to me that, saying that Father makes it personal where Almighty or another gender neutral term would not, why not say Mother? That's as personal as Father. I agree with the last speaker. It's because men wrote this, and that Judaism is a very patriarchal religion.
And certainly when you're reading the prayer and when you're hearing the words, you can interpret it as mother. Right? The beauty of this is
no,
that
but what you said, the commentator, was the reason for the word father is because it's personal.
Yes, that's what he said.
Okay, mother is just as personal as father.
100%. You are correct, Carol. Remember that Bachi ibn Pekuda was also from a while ago, and he was a male. So for him, there's nothing more personal than a male. But perhaps we can understand that. We can take this idea of something that's personal that he was talking about and retranslate that idea so it has meaning for us today. The goal is we want the music to reach our souls, but we also want to allow the words to reach our souls too. And if that means translating it in a way that resonates for us, perhaps some of that means translating it to our mother, our guardian, right? That would be okay. We just have to figure out what that looks like for us. How does this prayer humble us? How does this prayer connect to us? How do we feel God's close connection through the words that we're saying when we hear Avinu Malkeinu?
Rabbi,
yeah.
I'm very much into gender neutral, and I have no problems with using mother. However, we are dealing with the high holidays, and in our families, father was always the stern one and mother was always the warm one. And so when I plead to father, I'm projecting that I want him to not be stern, but to love us all and help us pass into the next year and through the gates. Mom, I could put my arms around and I could talk her into it, so to speak. But my father, the stern one, I have to convince that I really mean this, that I have taken to heart the harsh words that say, who shall live and who shall die, who shall pass through the gates, etc. And so to me, it's a stern warning that you better take this seriously because Father has got his finger out and he's pointing at you.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying that this is so personal, right? It's not the right answer for everyone because there might be some of us who grew up and who was the stern one in our house? It was the mother, right? And so our understanding might be very different from that. Or maybe we grew up with two mothers or two fathers or grandparents and so the wordings that we use might be different depending on our personal experiences.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I think of personally God and the word Father as and in the sense of being a protector, my protector, and rather than other people think of the word as stern. I mean, when I think of my father as someone who cared enough and earned the money for the family and looked after us and was our protector. And from my spiritual point of view, Father and God are sort of in the same category for me.
Rabbi, when I was growing up, I of course had that same feeling in regard to Father. And I remember, and I don't know if it's the last prayer book or two ago, but it used to say our Father, our King in English. And I remember being happier about the way the new prayer book is written and the fact that it's kept in Hebrew and it keeps it a more generalized idea of a powerful being without necessarily identifying gender. And I've come to like that much better.
Yeah, what I love about what they did in this prayer book is because they just left the Hebrew, they made it so that all of us reading the prayer can connect with it in the way that makes sense to us. Perhaps a more general idea of God actually does work for us in this prayer. Perhaps masculine, feminine, however we want to envision it. Even our connection of what a father figure or what a mother figure represents, it's going to vary from person to person because we're all individuals with our own individual ideas and experiences. And so by keeping Avinu Malkeinu here, part of the reason that I'm bringing this up, part of the reason that we're going through it, is so that when the prayer comes, we can actually think about this in perhaps a deeper way than we have before. We can think about, okay, what does my relationship look like with God right now? How do I humble myself before God? What does that look like for me?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I'm getting hung up on the word king. Father is a godly construct, shall we say. King is a man-made construct. And I'm kind of glad that I never thought about it before because I'm just moved by the word Avinu Malkeinu because a king, as soon as you said king, I went to, it's a hierarchy, it's a place of power, but exclusionary power, whereas father or mother is godly, is in God's image, I suppose. I don't know. Now I'm sorry I know because I'm going to get hung up on this. But but the king makes it something not personal. The king sits on a throne. A king is removed from people. A king is judgmental.
Right.
Yeah, and that's you don't. Yeah, I guess you do humble yourself before God, but I mean before a king, but not by choice, I would assume.
Yeah, so it's a really good point when you bring up, and that actually, I think, is part of the point of Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu is personal, Malkeinu is not. And isn't that so in line with our reality? Right? We want some comfort. We want to know that we have a protector. We want to know that we have a shoulder to cry on, right? When we need that we have that support, that cheerleader. That's the Avinu. But God is also bigger and more distant. There is so much in this world that is beyond our control that we do need to humble ourselves before God. And that makes us far less comfortable. It certainly makes me a lot less comfortable, right? Because it's just admitting how vulnerable we are. I think part of the reason that COVID-19 has been so difficult, despite, on top of the fact that there have been thousands and thousands of people who died, that were stuck in our homes and so on, is because it always reminds us constantly that we can do everything right and yet we can get sick. We can have the healthiest immune system in the world, and that does not necessarily stop us from ending up in a hospital or worse. And just that recognition, it's uncomfortable, but it's needed. Because when we confront it and when we recognize it head on the High Holy Days, it pushes us to live our lives in more sincere ways. It pushes us to recognize just how precious life is. What has happened over the past 6 months? We've picked up the phone to call people who perhaps we've started to get out of touch with. We've started to realize where our priorities actually are. COVID in some ways is like an extended High Holy Days. And so, yeah, the Malkeinu, let's get hung up on it. Let's let ourselves get hung up on it, because I think it forces us to go to an uncomfortable place that is a place of growth and a place of just acknowledging realities that sometimes we might want to avoid. I want to just bring us back to a couple things because I don't want to take up too much of the cantor's time, and I know he has a lot he wants to do with you as well. But the Avinu Malkeinu prayer, it ends with these words. It ends with saying, "Our Father, our King, be gracious to us and answer us. We have little merit," that's the humbling part. "Act justly and lovingly with us and save us." So it ends, I think, on a very personal note. Yes, God, we're standing before you. We're humbling ourselves before you. Now be there with you. Be there with us. We feel you. Save us. And please just be there at these difficult moments. This is also another piece from the Talmud. I know I've been throwing a lot of Talmud in. There's good stuff in there. But the final words of this prayer ask for favor and kindness, even though we might not deserve it. Again, the humbling piece. The Talmud mentions this kind of kindness and reflecting on the way that we should strive to imitate the divine. Just as God is compassionate and merciful, so too should you be compassionate and merciful. In this moment of asking God to deal kindly with us, we think, how might we be kind to ourselves and to others in this coming year? There's just one more reading that I wanted to bring in, and this actually comes straight from our Erev Rosh Hashanah service, which is just an interpretive kind of piece based on Avinu Malkeinu. And you'll see that it brings in some of the other texts that we've actually read. We haven't forgotten Avinu Malkeinu. Though we've overthrown kings and we disobey fathers, and we have no great liking for absolute power, speaking to what you were saying, Renee, Akiva stood before you in a time of drought, and his words went up like a flame on the altar. Avinu Malkeinu, you are alone, are our ruler. Avinu Malkeinu, have compassion for us. Tonight we speak again in a time of drought. Dry ground beneath us, no water, only rock. Not a hunger for bread or thirst or water, but hearts that are longing to hear God's voice, for the sea of faith is all but gone. The tide's gone out on the empty beach. The world mocks our hopes and life tests our courage. Why do the wicked live on and prosper? Why are you silent when they prey on the innocent? And if your dominion is kindness and justice, why is creation in so much pain? Avinu Malkeinu, sustain our souls. Send rain to our roots. Help us to find a way to pray. Make us humble and forgiving of ourselves and one another. Avinu Malkeinu, renew these words. Help us to speak them with conviction and believe their truth. 100 generations stood before the ark, and they lifted up their voices like flame on the altar, and they put their trust and kindness in kindness and justice. And they gave their strength to make the promise real. Avinu Malkeinu, we haven't forgotten you. Avinu Malkeinu, bring us back to you. I want us to allow those words to just carry in the air and for us to reflect upon them as we hear some of the melodies of Avinu Malkeinu and some of the understandings behind those melodies that the cantor will offer us now.
Avinu Malkeinu, Oneinu Vaneinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Oneinu Vaneinu, Kilein Vanu Masi, Asei Manu, Tzedaka v'chesed, Asei Manu, Tzedaka v'chesed, ve'oshienu, Avinu Malkeinu, Vaneinu Vaneinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Vaneinu Vaneinu, Ki ein Vanu Ma'asi. So music, one could argue, has no gender. Music is an interpretation, or should be an interpretation, I believe, of the text. Chazonis or chazanut, while of course we all recognize that the creators of it were men in a patriarchal society, it stripped away the patriarchy in many ways. And Avinu Malkeinu, to me, is the perfect example of that. Throughout the entire day of Yom Kippur, we spend a lot of our time in what we call the Slicha mode. The Slicha mode is a cantorial mode of repentance, of apology, if you will. So, for instance, when we're saying all of our al-chet, this is the slicha mode. This is a very minor key and focused on repentance, focused on our own kind of anguish, if you will. And then suddenly, out of this slicha mode comes this Avinu Malkeinu, which breaks out of the mode. In fact, it centers, to speak like in musical geek terms for a moment, it centers around the five of the scale. And anyone who knows music theory knows that the five is always major. Even in a minor key, the five becomes major. The 4 and the 5, usually, the 4 and the 5 chords in the scale become major. We call them the perfect chords, actually. A perfect fourth, a perfect fifth. Those are always a major moment. And so here we take the slicha mode, this minor mode that we're in, and for a moment, we jump to the 5, we jump to the major, and still, though, keep going back to that minor, even within it. Da dee da 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 da. Oh, we're right back into minor there again. But then we go back to the major. Oh, back to the minor again. So it's this beautiful mixing, if you will, that reminds us why we're there, but at the same time begins to show that, if you will, that light that starts shining through, that light that begins to shine through. And I will tell you that when I was growing up, the melody that I just sang was the only Avinu Malkeinu that I knew. I know for many of you, the only Avinu Malkeinu you've ever known is the Janowski, which is the one that we played earlier. But this other melody was the only one that I knew growing up. It's the only one that we used in my synagogue. I think it's still the only one that they use in that synagogue to this day. But then when I came to Temple Bethel, I was introduced to this beautiful rendition by Janowski. And this beautiful choral moment, if you will, Avinu Malkeinu, Shema Kuleinu. This beautiful draying kind of moment that brings us back to that pleading that you were talking about, Mike. That pleading kind of moment in front of God. We are standing here before God. Avinu Malkeinu is typically is sung before the open ark. It is chanted before the open ark, and it is this kind of pleading moment. Whether it is that we are pleading to our parent, or whether it is that we are pleading in some way before some sovereign. So whether it's a personal pleading, I think we can all relate to that. I mean, we plead differently to our parents than we do to a police officer who pulled you over. Let's say, you know, a figure of the law, if you will, which is kind of what a king to me would be. I want to share with you a couple of other melodies that I find to be hauntingly beautiful. One of them a little bit more so than the other, and then I'm going to close with something that's a little bit more modern, and it's actually kind of they call it a mashup. So it's a mashup of several different Avinu Malkeinu melodies. So I'm going to share. I'm just going to share my sound, because we don't need to see these; we need to hear them. And I want for us to be able to hear them beautifully. This first melody is by Michael Isaacson. By the way, I will tell you that doing the research for this particular class was really hard, because there aren't a lot of melodies for Avinu Malkeinu. There really aren't. Everywhere we look, we find either the traditional Avinu Malkeinu, or we find the Janowski. Even Barbra Streisand has recorded the Janowski Avinu Malkeinu, and it's gorgeous, by the way. It's absolutely a beautiful interpretation. But here is a melody by Michael Isaacson. It's a choral melody, and I'll let you be the judge of whether you like it or not. So I'm going to stop that melody there. It's interesting because there seems to be this counterpoint of almost two very distinctly different melodies happening at the same time here, which for me is very uncomfortable. It's from a composition standpoint, and this is one of the reasons why I always look to Michael Isaacson for a moment, because he is kind of uh, he's the composition teacher, if you will. So from a composition standpoint, it's always quite interesting. But I didn't necessarily find this melody to be so comfortable for me. But then it comes back together at the end. Anybody else have a comment on this particular melody?
Sadly, the melody puts me a bit asleep. The melody puts me asleep, and I need the sharp, strong voice of one person to jar me awake and think about why I'm standing in prayer and what I need to do.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you.
Cantor. It
Yes.
was a little too churchy for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a little too churchy.
Mm-hmm.
It was very pretty, but I felt like I was at a concert, not in synagogue.
Yeah.
I didn't like the counterpoint.
Yeah. It's uncomfortable, that counterpoint, isn't it? It really is. So
I did not feel uplifted at all.
yeah, I think this next melody I'm going to play for you is going to uplift you quite a bit.
Okay.
And it really is. It's beyond the traditional melodies that I'm accustomed to. This is certainly one of my favorite melodies that I have found and come across, and it's sung by one of my favorite cantors, Cantor Lizzie Weiss. I adore her, and this is a newish melody by Josh Nelson. Rabbi's been chatting with me, and I already had this one. I didn't realize when you first asked me the question, Rabbi, that it was for sure the Josh Nelson, but I was pretty sure it was.
Yeah, I was doing research to figure it out.
Right, exactly. So listen to this melody. Josh Nelson, one of our very contemporary Jewish songwriters. You might be familiar. He's the one who wrote L'Ador Vador that I sing oftentimes. We are gifts and we are blessings. We are history and song. That particular melody. He also wrote Yihiyu leratzon imrefi vehegyon libi lefanecha. And then he wrote this magnificent piece. Now, Josh, by the way, for those that don't know, because those of us who know him, we see him at conferences and stuff like that, and he's this rock and roller, big curly hair, plays multiple instruments. And when you first meet him, you think, oh, he's just a really talented musician. Well, he happens to have also, I believe, 2 or 3 master's degrees in conducting and composition, and very, very educated, went to the Berklee School of Music, and incredible talent, in a very hip guy, which is kind of nice, So here's this beautiful Avinu Malkeinu by Josh Nelson.
Avinu Malkeinu Chodneinu Aneinu Ki ein banu masi
be sealed.
Comments on this melody?
Although I think it's very lovely, but it doesn't have the punch. It's hard
Right.
to be the best, though.
It's much more. It's much more it much more feels like the one that we're used to because it's one voice and it's much more solemn than the choral rendition was. It still doesn't feel like Avinu Malkeinu to me, though.
It's still too upbeat for me. It's not minor key enough.
Yeah. It's not pleading enough for me.
And that's in how it's sung, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wish I had the version that Melanie Cooperman sang, because she also did it with a choir behind her for the end of it. And it was the most emotional Avinu Malkeinu I've ever heard in my life. So.
Yeah, maybe it was her voice. It almost when she started to sing, I started to think I'm in a Broadway theater. It was very theatrical.
Okay.
Sometimes I wonder if and it's a very rare instance when a song can't be improved upon, that there's a power to the original melody and it doesn't date itself. You know, we often have different versions, like you said, for La Dorvador and different things, but there's something about maybe sometimes the tradition of a certain melody has its purpose and place. And even though this was closer, I still found that there's just something about the original one that you hear in your head all year, whereas you don't necessarily carry other tunes in your head. And so some things are good as they were.
Well, and honestly, Georgia, that's why I've been with the temple all of my 25 years, know that I've changed many melodies at the temple, but there are certain things that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I sort of feel that way about the Janowski. That being said, this Nelson Avinu Malkeinu, if we were to do a more contemporary service for High Holy Days, I would bring it in a minute. And while I do hear what you're saying, Renee, about Lizzie's performance of it, or Lizzie's interpretation of it, maybe being a little theatrical. First of all, I'm going to argue for a moment that much of what we do musically, much of what's been written musically for the High Holy Days is in some ways quite theatrical. Only because it's that one moment. It's that we get one shot at this particular thing. It's not every Friday night. We get one shot, and we want to hit you in your kishkas, and we want to have it have meaning for you immediately. But I would probably interpret this a little bit differently. What I love about it is that in the writing of it, see, I listen to music beyond the actual performance of it, and so I'm listening to how it's written, and he wrote the pleading in it. Avinu, Malkeinu, Avinu. So for me, I hear the pleading so beautifully written and interpreted by the composer, and it's one of those moments where I was really taken by this. I was going to share something else. I'm just going to share with you about it because we are running out of time, and I want to be respectful of. I know Rabbi wants to wrap things up and have a little bit of interpretation maybe going on with all of you for a moment, but. I came across this amazing recording of the Portnoy brothers, Portnoy. These are the sons of Marshall Portnoy, who's an incredible orchestra conductor and Jewish songwriter and composer himself. And his sons, who were born in, I think, Manchester, England, if I'm not mistaken, they came together and then they moved to Israel. they joined together and created this band, if you will, called the Portnoy Brothers, and they did this incredible Avinu Malkeinu mashup. And I would really recommend that you go and listen to it on your own, and let me know. Send me an email. Let me know what you think about it. It's definitely an interpretation. It's not meant for the sanctuary, the way that they're performing it in any way, but it shows just how important this text is to them, that they wanted to interpret it and make it something that might reach more people in some way outside of the synagogue. And it really is, I've spoken about this at length at other times about the fact that a lot of liturgical holy music becomes in Israel a radio hit, and it does, and I think that's what they were going for with this. But I would certainly recommend that you go and listen to it. Again, it's the Portnoy Brothers, and it's the Avinu Malkeinu mashup. So, thank you for allowing me to dray on a little bit about Chazanut and about musical interpretation, and I only hope that as I interpret the music, that it touches you in some way. Rabbi?
Yeah. Is the sound? No. So can you stop sharing your sound because it's creating something funny?
About that.
Okay. Yeah, it's still happening. I don't know what's going on. We'll have to figure that out. But yeah, it's over the past hour, we've looked at some of the meaning underneath Avinu Malkeinu, the Talmud story that inspired the prayer to begin with, the various ways to interpret it. And I just want to stop with a hope for all of us that however we interpret this prayer, whatever words we use in our own minds as we interpret it, as we internalize the cantor's interpretation of it when he's singing it, and just taking in the words that are within our machzor, that it can truly resonate in our souls, that we can humble ourselves before God in the way that Akiva did, that we can allow ourselves to be moved by it and inspired by it so that we can do all of the work that is needed to make this world a little more whole, that we can wrestle with the messiness of this world and also the enormous potential that is ahead of us. On Rosh Hashanah, we say that it is the beginning of the year, right? It's when the world is created, and also Hayom Harat Olam. This is a new year filled with enormous potential and possibilities. And I just hope that we're able to make the most of all of those and find great inspiration in doing so. Does anyone have any last thoughts or reflections on any of this, whether it's the music or the text that we've come to explore here?
I'm reminded when I was attempting to learn how to play the piano while working full-time and raising 2 children, the one thing I remember is all the Jewish songs are written in the key of D, which has a note of sadness to it. And it's probably that key of D that sends an alert to the heart to wake up and take account and take stock of what is, to find a way to make it better.
Yeah, we call D minor the key of our people.
I had a question going back to the very first one that's created. Why did they make a point of not once but twice talking about the rabbis descending to the ark? And we didn't talk about that, but it was very deliberate using it twice. And I'm just trying to get a visual and wondered if you could just maybe help us, or at least help me kind of know why they were so specific about that.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that temples were not designed the way they are today. The way our temples are designed today are really based on Protestant churches. So if you go to, like, let's say in Israel, in Sfat, for example, they have a few synagogues there where you actually look and you're sitting around in a circle. That's how the seats are designed. And right in the middle, there's a staircase that goes up to where the podium is. But if you're going down, like you kind of descend to go to the ark where the Torah is. It's really interesting. So I think they're just using a different visual for a different time. But this idea of descending is also really a meaningful one. And in the story of Jonah, we'll talk about this more in Yom Kippur, but there is a lot of imagery of descent and ascent. And I think that when we're talking about descending, we're talking about humbling ourselves. So it's not just happenstance. There is this ultimate feeling of humility that appears throughout the prayer.
Thank you.
Yeah, Pam.
I'm wondering, I had never thought of this before. I love this program. If this prayer, I know this prayer is so important and evocative, why we don't repeat it every day in the month of Elul? I'm enjoying Psalm 27, but I'm just thinking that saying this as a community, I've never heard of that being done, but it just occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, there are prayers of slichot that are traditionally done throughout the month of Elul. I haven't done that every morning because I felt like 15 to 20 minutes was probably the limit. But yeah, it's interesting about Avinu Malkeinu very specifically.
And the line that often catches me, and it did today, is Shema Kolenu. And a few days ago, when you were talking about the rabbi's reflection that you always read, and you were talking about Shema, my mouth just said Shema Kolenu. So maybe it's internalized.
Yeah, and Shema Kolenu, for anyone who doesn't know what that means, Shema, of course, means hear or listen. And Kolenu, kol means voice. Enu, that ending, is our voice. So it's hear our voice. Thank you all so much for offering so much of your questions, your thoughts, your insights. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Rabbi, is this available on Safaria as well, the information for tonight?
No, it isn't because it's in a PowerPoint, but I can send it to you. I just did this one a little bit differently.
Should I put my email back in for you?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think I can find it, but
you.
if you put it in, I'll make sure to send it.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Really wonderful.
I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
There you go, Rabbi. I sent it to you.